This set of slides is getting a bit long, so I'm going to go through the remaining issues pretty quickly. For homosexuality, what do you think Bentham said? I mean, he's writing in the 1700s, 1800s, a long time ago. People were, didn't have as modern views about things as we do now. So what do you think he would have said about homosexuality? Well, believe it or not, Bentham's position was that there isn't anything wrong with homosexuality. In fact, he said that sex is one of the few things that human beings can do that generates a whole lot of pleasure and has relatively little pain associated with it. I mean, there are dangers of sexually transmitted diseases, and there's possibility of heartbreak, and there's possibility of unwanted pregnancy, but there are ways of mitigating against those various dangers and risks. And so he just thought, and sex feels really good, right? Sex is one of the things people can do in addition to eating and drinking and, having good, good times with friends. These are things that people can do that are relatively easy to do, and they generate a lot of pleasure for people. They make people's lives a lot more enjoyable for them. And so he thought governments shouldn't be punishing people for having whatever kind of sex they want, whether it's homosexual or heterosexual or whatever. In fact, he thought, and he wrote about this, they should be encouraging people to have sex. Governments should be should have policies that make it as easy as possible for people to have as much sex as they want to, because it's going to lead to a happier society overall. So he was actually surprisingly modern about this. And he also made fun of people who thought homosexuality was a sin. He was very confident that there was not anything intrinsically wrong with that or any sexual behavior. And part of why he could probably be so confident about that was, again, because he really believed in this principle of utility as the true standard of morality. And so even though a lot of religions at the time would have said that homosexuality was a sin and so on, Bentham just thought that all those positions didn't make any sense at all, that the principle of utility was the right standard, and that sex was actually a good thing. What about slavery? Well, it should kind of be obvious if you think about it. Think about how much positive utility is generated by the institution of slavery as it existed, for instance, in the American South in the 1800s. And think about how much positive utility was generated by it. So which do you think is greater, the total pain generated by slavery or whatever good things were produced by slavery? Sure, slavery probably produced some good things, like it made some white people's lives in the South easier, and it probably produced some wealth. There are probably some good things that came from it, but the total pain produced by it is astronomical, right? Would be just extreme suffering for large groups of people. So there's almost no way that the principle of utility could justify slavery, and it's just almost guaranteed to come out saying that slavery is a horrendous practice. And that's what Bentham himself said, and he advocated for the abolition of slavery in the late 1700s and 1800s. And likewise about women's rights. So if you ask, which is a world that has more utility overall, a world where women's role in society is very precisely circumscribed, and they're expected and allowed to only do a narrow range of things, whereas men can do a much wider range of things? Or is it better, would it be a society that had more overall utility to have women have the same range of options as men do in their lives, so that if they want to be homemakers and caretakers as the traditional roles had them be, then they can be. But if they want to be doctors or lawyers, politicians, and so on, they want to participate in society more broadly, then they are able to do that. Okay, which is a better society, one where they're restricted in their options or one where they have a wide range of options? Well, given that women are half the human race, half of the human species, okay, and given that if you asked any man that question, which type of life would you prefer to live? One where you have all those options or one where you don't? Almost everyone would say, give me the options, right? Because they know that their life is going to be better off overall having the options. So for that reason, it seems pretty clear that if one is following the principle of utility, one ought to advocate for the same range of options for women in their lives as men have in their lives. And that, in fact, is what Bentham advocated for. So he advocated, for instance, for the right to vote for women, and he advocated for the right of women to participate in the larger society and not be restricted in their options in that way. And then finally, what about the treatment of animals? So again, this is the 1700s, 1800s, so hundreds of years ago. Times were different back then. Meat eating was even more a standard practice than it is today. What do you think his position would have been about treating animals? Okay, so the answer is Bentham was very much against the treatment of animals as merely objects to serve human interests. And the reason for that is that animals can experience pain and pleasure. So if you're going to be a utilitarian consistently, when you recognize that animals can experience happiness and unhappiness in the sense of pain and pleasure, which is the only sense that utilitarianism cares about. It's how it defines pain and pleasure. Bentham thought when you recognize that animals can experience pain and pleasure, then you have an obligation, if you're going to follow the principle of utility consistently, to take their pain and pleasure into account as well in the total overall utility. So I know that earlier I spoke about the principle of utility as asking what is the total pain and pleasure generated for the community involved. And I think the assumption was that that community was people. And sometimes I even put it that way. I said generates the greatest pleasure and the least pain for the greatest number of people. That's sometimes the way that the principle of utility is summarized in other literature as well. But Bentham recognized that animals can feel pain and pleasure, and he thought that consistently applied, we ought to take their interests into consideration too. That is, their pain and pleasure into consideration too. And if we do that, then we find that the joy that I get from eating a hamburger, or that lots of people get from eating hamburgers, does not outweigh the pain to the cow of being raised in confinement, slaughtered at some point, relatively prime point in their life, and then being served on patties for all of us to eat and enjoy. The pain that is generated by using animals for food and for clothing, just killing them indiscriminately, and the way that we keep them alive in factories or on farms in these ways that are often very uncomfortable for them, very unnatural for them, and where their instincts can't be satisfied in various ways because the way that we keep them, maybe the drugs that we put into them to foster milk production with cows, for instance. I don't know if you've seen the images of cows with udders that are so full they look like they're going to split their skin because they have so much milk in them, and that's partly generated by drugs that are given to the cows to get them to produce more milk. So Bentham was an early advocate for a better treatment of animals, more humane treatment of animals, and he was a vegetarian, and he advocated vegetarianism, and utilitarians today are often, some of the most well-known utilitarians today are also some of the most well-known advocates for more ethical treatment of animals. And again, it comes more or less directly as a result of adopting the principle of utility. It's kind of a almost direct consequence of adopting the principle of utility. Well, that wraps up our discussion of Bentham, and we'll see each other next week. Feel free to send me questions in the Q&A, and good luck on your reading responses. See you next week.